Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today to celebrate one of the seminal moments in American civil rights history. This week marks the 29th anniversary of the signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act. On July 26, 1990, President George H.W. Bush signed a sweeping, bipartisan bill that acknowledged and affirmed the rights of people with disabilities. The passage of the so-called ADA promised that people with disabilities are included in the guarantee of fundamental rights. Just by way of example, the right to petition the court when discriminated against, the right to apply for and be considered for a job, the right and the access to vote, the right to economic security, the right to live where you want to live. 29 years later, our country is better because we agreed to make the opportunities of our country accessible to all. The ADA changed the lives of 61 million Americans with disabilities and has made our nation more accessible. The ADA proclaimed that Americans with disabilities must have the right and the means to fully participate in their communities. The ADA offers a path towards a truly accessible nation and elevates the voices of millions of individuals. One of those voices belongs to Jean Searle from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Jean works at Disability Rights Pennsylvania, where she protects the rights of people with disabilities so they may live the lives they choose, free from abuse, neglect, discrimination, and segregation. As a child and a young adult, Jean was forced to live in an institution. In that institution, she faced many indignities, the worst of which may have been having her infant child taken from her without her consent. Simply because Jean lives with a disability, it often was assumed that she was not capable of making her own decisions. But she worked hard to find a way out of that institution. When she finally succeeded, she chose to live independently in her community and has found a fulfilling career in Harrisburg. The rights affirmed by the ADA and the services and supports Medicaid and other programs have provided have made it possible for Jean to be a full citizen of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and, yes, even the United States of America. Jean has dedicated her life to protecting the rights of people with disabilities. During this ADA anniversary week, it is also fitting that today is Jean's birthday. So Jean, looking at her picture on my left, I want to say happy birthday, and I know many here would wish the same if she were here on the floor with us in person. But I'm honored to celebrate her birthday by sharing a part of her story. And let me pause here today that also, almost 30 years ago, or I should say almost 30 years after, her infant, as I referred to earlier, her infant was taken from her. Jean recently had the opportunity to meet him for the first time. Jean often says that to make the world a better place, we need to spend more time listening to people with disabilities and learning from the disability community. Well said, Jean. When I listen, I hear about the greatness of the ADA and at the same time that there is still much more to be done. One of those things is to protect what we have. That includes protecting access to health care, preventing the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, and ensuring that Medicaid remains intact. We also need to combat threats to people with disabilities. Over the past 2 years, we've seen a systemic and concerted effort to sabotage supports necessary for equality, opportunity, and full participation for people with disabilities. What this administration has failed to do with legislation, they are trying to accomplish through regulation and court cases. Cutting Medicaid is contrary to the goals of the ADA, and it makes it difficult or even potentially impossible for people with disabilities to work, to go to school, or to be engaged in their community. So while we protect the hard-fought rights the disability community has earned, we can also build upon the promises of the ADA. As we celebrate the 29th anniversary of the ADA, we can do at least three things. Honor the great advancements that have been made because of the ADA. Remain vigilant to attacks on those civil rights. And third, work to ensure that the goals of the ADA are realized for all people with disabilities. I believe Jean's own words make the point clearer than I can. Here's what she says, quote, "We must never go back. We must never forget that the struggle that people with disabilities have gone through they're still going through today. We must never go back," as Jean said. So as we celebrate the 20th anniversary of the ADA, I promise, and I know it's the promise of many members of Congress, to never forget that struggle, to stand side by side with the disability community to fully accomplish the goals of the ADA.
Senator from Pennsylvania, yield for a moment.
Yes, Mr. President.
Senator from Ohio.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate Senator Casey's always advocacy for disabled Americans and for children especially, and just wanted to make a brief comment. I know he's got some other remarks to make, but a brief comment on his support for Medicaid and the efforts that we've done together in the Finance Committee in fighting against President Trump's attacks on Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act. And I know in my state, expansion of Medicare and what came out of that meant 900,000 more people had insurance, including a whole lot of people that were disabled. And I just wanted to, I know that Pennsylvania is the same way. I wanted to thank Senator Casey.
Well, thank the senator from Ohio, the senior senator, who makes a point about the importance of Medicaid broadly in the context of healthcare, but especially with regard to Americans with disabilities. And I thank him for his comments, but also thank him for his advocacy. Mr. President, I'm going to move to a second topic, and this involves a visit that I made just a week ago, I guess it'll be a week ago Friday, to McAllen, Texas, with a delegation of senators. I guess there were 13 of us in total. During that visit, throughout the course of a day, we toured DHS detention facilities, DHS meaning Department of Homeland Security detention facilities, including the Border Patrol facility at McAllen, Texas, and processing centers in both Donna and Ursula, Texas. I saw children who needed better care. I saw overcrowding with adults packed into cages or glass-enclosed rooms where you couldn't hear the voices of those behind the glass. I saw the need for hygiene products and better access to showers. We also saw at the same time Catholic Charities, the Respite Center, run by Sister Norma Pimentel, known to so many as just Sister Norma, where migrants were welcomed, migrants were cared for, and migrants were treated with compassion. I believe the White House's policies take the opposite approach, not welcoming migrants, but pushing them away. And I believe several of those policies make it bad not only for the migrants or immigrants, it's also bad for DHS personnel who have to do the work every day, and it's also bad for the security of our nation. I know that our delegation last Friday met a number of dedicated personnel who work hard and care about the families, but not all, not that I can say that about all of those working. So when there is mistreatment or when there is abuse, we need to make sure there is accountability, full accountability. But I know at the same time there are folks who work in our government who may not agree with the White House policy on immigration or asylum or migration policy generally, but who have difficult work to do. And those who are doing good work and showing compassion and respect, I commend them for that. But instead of closing the door on asylum seekers who are fleeing terrible violence and persecution. We should adopt policies that are more humane and will help alleviate instead of exacerbate the humanitarian crisis. We should utilize effective alternatives to detention, like the Family Case Management Program, a pilot program started in the last administration and pretty much ended in this administration, which had a 99% attendance rate or success rate, attendance at immigration court proceedings. The Family Case Management Program also had a 99% compliance with ICE monitoring requirements. We should ensure that migrant children are cared for by child welfare workers and have their medical needs fully met. We should also work to address the violence, the poverty, and the persecution that are causing so many to flee. I'm a co-sponsor of the Central American Reform and Enhancement Act, legislation that would address the root causes of migration by increasing aid to the Northern Triangle, creating new options for refugees to apply for entry from Mexico and Central America, and of course, increasing the number of immigration judges to reduce court backlogs and creating new criminal penalties for smuggling and defrauding of immigrants. We know that some of the dollars recently appropriated will help on some of these priorities, but we have to make sure the dollars are spent wisely and appropriately and in full compliance with the law. We are indeed a nation of laws, and we're also a nation of immigrants. These two principles are intertwined in our values, and they are not competing values. We should be trying over and over again, both parties, both houses, and the administration, to pass something comparable to the comprehensive immigration reform bill that this body passed in 2013 that did not get a vote in the House. Let me conclude this part of my remarks with this. The problem is not that we must choose between principles like being a rule of law country and being a nation of immigrants. The problem is that our immigration system is badly broken. And if there are suggestions to be made to improve the asylum process, we should be open to that. But pushing immigrants away and ending or short-circuiting or undermining the asylum process is not in the interest of the country. It's entirely possible to have an immigration system that both respects the rule of law and treats all individuals with human dignity. So I'll continue to press the administration and the House and the Senate to work on bipartisan solutions so our immigration system again reflects those American values. Mr. President, I will conclude my remarks by raising the third topic, and it's timely for today. Just wanted to do two things with regard to the service and the work of now former Special Counsel Robert Mueller, but also talk about the report that he issued. There's a reference in a narrative about Robert Mueller's service in Vietnam that I won't add to the record because it's very long, but I'll quote from it just for a couple of minutes. This is an account by the publication Wired, and it is a long account, but I'll just read briefly the beginning of it about his service. Just imagine this. Someone who grew up with probably not too many concerns about economic security, someone who had the benefit of great education, then volunteered to serve in Vietnam. This particular vignette talks about after serving 9 months at war, he was finally due, he meaning Robert Mueller, finally due for a few short days of R&R outside the battle zone. Mueller had seen intense combat since he last said goodbye to his wife. He received the Bronze Star. He had received the Bronze Star with distinction for valor for his actions in one battle, and he had been airlifted out of the jungle during another firefight after being shot in the thigh. Robert Mueller and his wife Ann had spoken only twice since he had left for Vietnam. Then it goes on to say why he wanted to keep serving in the Marine Corps. Quote, "I didn't relish the U.S. Marine Corps absent combat, unquote. So said Robert Mueller. Then it goes on to talk about his decision to go to law school after being in Vietnam, and with the goal of serving his country as a prosecutor. He went on to lead the criminal division of the Justice Department and to prosecute a lot of bad guys. My words, not words from the publication. Then became director of the FBI 1 week before September 11th, 2001, and stayed on to become the Bureau's longest-serving director since J. Edgar Hoover. And yet, throughout his 5-decade career, that year of combat experience with the Marines has loomed large in Mueller's mind. And I'm quoting, "I'm most proud the Marine Corps deemed me worthy of leading other Marines," unquote, he said in 2009. So that's his background, just some of his background. Service to his country in Vietnam, service as a federal prosecutor for many, many years, then called upon to serve his country again. He is the embodiment of public service. He gives integrity and meaning and value to what President Kennedy called us all to do, to not ask what our country can do for us, but what we can do for our country. Robert Mueller has answered that call over and over again. He's a person of integrity and ability. So just a few minutes, Mr. President, before I yield the floor, I wanted to talk about some of his work. One of the points that then Special Counsel Mueller made in a statement, I guess back in May, was he first of all outlined how the Russian Federation interfered with our election and pointed to the serious consequences of that. But then he also talked about how when the second volume of the report deals with obstruction, he reminded us in that statement, at least I took from it, my impression of his statement was not just the seriousness of what Russia did, but the seriousness and the gravity of obstructing that kind of investigation. So if someone wanted to read just a portion of this report, the almost 500 pages, if you wanted to just zero in on some key parts of the volume 2 about obstruction, you could start on page 77. That's a section entitled "The President's Efforts to Remove the Special Counsel." Then there are other instances, several instances of obstruction, alleged obstruction there. So if you read between pages 77 and 120 of volume 2, you're going to learn a lot about obstruction. Let me just read a couple of the lines that the report sets forth. When the special counsel walks through the factual predicate of what happened in the first instance, where the president calls the White House counsel, Mr. McGahn, and says some things that the special counsel concluded was a directive to fire or have fired the special counsel. They say in the report on page, and this is volume 2, page 88, quoting, "Substantial evidence, however, supports the conclusion that the president went further and in fact directed McGahn to call Rosenstein to have the special counsel removed." Page 89, "Substantial evidence indicates that by June 17, 2017, the president knew his conduct was under investigation by a federal prosecutor who could present evidence of federal crimes to a grand jury." It goes on from there. In the intent section, where the special counsel has to lay out the evidence to prove intent, because if you can't prove intent, you can't go much further. Substantial evidence indicates that the president's attempts to remove the special counsel were linked to the special counsel's oversight of investigations that involved the president's conduct, and most immediately to reports that the president was being investigated for potential obstruction of justice, unquote. So they're just 3 vignettes from pages 88 and 89. Operative words there being substantial evidence. In other parts of the report, evidence is laid out. Sometimes they say there's not enough evidence, but substantial evidence, I think, is a compelling part of what we saw. Let me just quickly, because I know I'm over time. I will now move to page 113. Now, this is a separate section This section is entitled, "The President Orders McGahn," again, White House Counsel McGahn, "to deny that the President tried to fire the special counsel." So referring back to the earlier section. And then when they go through the evidence, they again get back to the consideration or the weighing of the evidence. I'm looking at volume 2, page 118. Again, those words, "Substantial evidence supports McGahn's account that the President had directed him to have the special counsel removed, including the timing and context of the President's directive, the manner in which McGahn reacted, the fact that the President had been told conflicts were insubstantial, were being considered by the Justice Department, and should be raised with the President's counsel rather than brought to McGahn," unquote. So you get the message I'm sending, and the last one is on page 120. Substantial evidence indicates the following facts. So I raise all that, Mr. President, because there's a lot of discussion about volume 2 and what might have been, what the conclusion might have been. The reason I refer to those areas of substantial evidence is that in May of this year, there was a statement by former federal prosecutors. We're told that as many as 1,000 bipartisan prosecutors from both parties signed a letter, and I'll just read one sentence from the letter. Quote, "Each of us," meaning these Republican and Democratic former prosecutors, "each of us believes that the conduct of President Trump described in Special Counsel Robert Mueller's report would, in the case of any other person not covered by the Office of Legal Counsel's policy against indicting a sitting president, result in multiple felony charges for obstruction of justice," end quote. I think those prosecutors, I believe those prosecutors, are resting that determination that they've made each individually on those areas of the report that begin with the words, "substantial evidence indicates." Mr. President, I would yield the floor.